So this lecture is from 1964, and it's called In a Vision of the Night. Now, if you read these lectures by yourself, you will know that I don't speak much on the redemption part of what Neville's speaking about, as far as being redeemed in Christ and his ideas of it and his experiences of it. And there's a reason why I don't. I'm sort of waiting for the right lecture to talk about it, because certain lectures he speaks about it more clearly than others. But in this one, I still think we should speak more about what we spoke about as far as third vision goes. Now, this one he speaks about how, when you have a dream, sometimes you can be its servant and other times you can be its master. And when we fall asleep at night, we sort of feel sort of taken like a victim to the dream, and we become a passenger, sort of watching it kind of happen. And other times we become awake inside of it. And in the moment you become awake inside of a dream is when you start to control it, you start to change it, you start to modify it. And he's basically asking us to you can start modifying it now, and then you will become awake. You'll start to see that there's a big connection between what's happening within one person and what's happening outside of them. And for this lecture, I'm going to have to read, because I don't want to just shorten it and modify it with my own way of speaking, because I want to read what's there. So he says, "Let me share with you now a story by a man that is respected." He goes on to say that this man is Carl Jung. He says Carl Jung is one of the great giants of the mind. If you name three, you cannot omit the name of Jung in any list of these three names when it comes to understanding the workings of the human mind. I'm assuming the other name would be William James. But he said, this is what Carl Jung said. He said, "One night I lay awake thinking of a sudden death of a friend whose funeral took place yesterday. I was deeply concerned, and suddenly I felt that he was in the room. It seemed to me he was standing at the foot of the bed, not as an apparition. Rather, it seemed like an inner vision of him. And then, as I felt his presence there, and saw him inwardly, as it were, because of my work I had to do something about it. And so I explained to myself that it was fantasy. But then I said to myself, suppose it's not fantasy. You have no proof that it is, and that it is not fantasy, so why not give him the benefit of the doubt and credit him with reality? No sooner had I made the decision to credit him with reality, he turned and walked towards the door. I was watching him walk towards the door, and then he beckoned me to follow him. And so in my imagination I followed him, and he led me through a garden onto a road, which led me to his home, several hundred yards away. When we got to his house, he led me into his study. Then he went forward, stood on a stool, and reached up and pointed to a volume, a second book of a set of 5. They were all bound in red. But he pointed to the second one on the second shelf from the top. He was standing on a stool, and as he pointed to the second book, all bound in red, then the vision came to an end, and I remained pondering on this strange experience. It was so strange and exciting to me that the next morning I thought I must investigate, so I walked up to my neighbor's home and asked the widow whether she would allow me to go into the library and look something, and she looked something up, and she willingly granted. I got into the library, and there under the shelves is a stool, the very stool I saw in my vision. I stood on the stool to reach the second shelf, and there were 5 books bound in red, translation from the novels by Emile Zola. I picked the second one out and read its title, and its title was On Death. The Legacy of Death was the title. Now, he said the contents of the book didn't mean much to him, but it was the title that was most significant. And so Neville goes on to now say that basically the main part that he found out of this story that was important was that he credited it with reality. That he took what was otherwise in his imagination, didn't think of it a fancy, and credited it with reality. And then it started to take upon reality. And I've shared that in other videos, is that I don't try to add so many tones of reality to my imaginal acts. I try to believe in them first, and then they start to become more and more real to me. I start to accept them first. Just like what Carl Jung did, is that he accepted, he credited it with reality. And then it started to take upon the form of reality. It wasn't just a fantasy. You can dismiss things in your mind and say, oh, it's just a fantasy. It's not going to ever happen. It's not real. But when you start to accept these things as reality, they start to take upon reality. That's how this works. And then he goes on to say, how can you brush this off? He's talking about Carl Jung's experience. How could he brush this off as coincidence? Like, how can you do that? You can't brush. Coincidence has no explanatory power. You'll find that word used so much in common talk. People would just mention coincidences as if it just means nothing. A strange incident happened, yet it means absolutely nothing, and don't look any further. That's the feeling I get from when we say coincidence. There's too many coincidences in my life for me to continue thinking about coincidence that way. I noticed a lot of people I've talked to about this, they have moments in their past where they realize about these coincidences that there was something within them that they felt something strange about it, yet they didn't investigate it further. And that's really all this is. So you can say Carl Jung just investigated this imaginal act further, this vision further. Just like Neville when he said, I will explore this regardless of consequences. I will explore it. And same goes for you when you go to imagine for yourself. Regardless of this is, you're going to credit with reality. You're going to give it the reality that you otherwise want to give this dream. You're going to stop making it a fantasy, stop making it a dream. And really what it had to do with his death, right? And Neville goes on to quote scripture. He says, I'm the God of the living and not of the dead. And Neville's so confident that we will all survive this world of death, this realm of death that we're in. And we will survive it. But then I'm gonna read him now, because I'm gonna read Neville, because he goes on, step by step, basically to speak on this, and I don't want to change it. So he says, now it brings me to this: you sit down to change your world, and you want something better than what you have, and so you begin to conjure a certain scene that would imply the fulfillment of your dream. You begin to conjure it. The average person cannot control their mind long enough to go from A to B. If, for instance, I assume that I am what reason denies, and what my senses deny, and at the very moment of my assumption I think of all the debts and what people know of to be me, I take it off. That doesn't fit. It's like a tight shoe. It doesn't quite fit me. And so I take off that assumption. If I could only put on the assumption. Now what's the next step? I assume that I am who I want to be. If it were true, my friends would know it. I wouldn't hide it from them. In fact, it should be so obvious it were true. They should see it. And the next step, the B step, would be to bring into my mind's eye and let them see me as they would see me were it true. Now, what's the next step? Well, C. He's basically listing A, B, or C. And then he sees the third step. He says, could they keep the secret? No. They would have to discuss it with friends. I would eavesdrop and listen to their discussion of the good fortune that has befall me. And so I would listen. Have you heard the good news? One would say to the other, you know what has happened to him? Who would have thought that he could ever get that? And I just listen. And then they tell a story. I'm conjuring up the whole thing. I know I am. But I can endow it with reality and not say it's a fantasy. Or can I endow it with reality? Can I credit it with reality and not say it's a fantasy? It's not an apparition. But because not a person is before me, not a thing is before me, that is not an apparition. So I would say it's a fantasy, sheer fantasy, all conjured up by imagination. But if I could say what Carl Jung said and give it now the benefit of the doubt and credit with reality, the minute I credit with reality, I'm believing. Whatsoever you ask in faith, believe you have received and you will. And so I want to stop there for a second. Again, he's explaining what one needs to do when you imagine. I've heard it differently in my own dreams, actually, where you want to almost feel like you almost want to let go of the feeling that I'm only imagining this. You want to let go of that while you're imagining. You don't want to keep that feeling there. You want to take that off. My issue was never that I couldn't think of it or imagine it. It's that some part of me was always, I always felt this feeling of, well, I'm only imagining this. The only way to let that go was I just stopped listening to it. And the moment I stopped listening to it and accepted the imaginal act, that's when it became real to me. And then you sort of just let it happen to you. That's what I've noticed, that you almost want to set the whole thing up and then it happened to you. Meaning that you aren't in control of it anymore. You set the whole thing up and then you sort of just like press the play button and it starts to just go. That's how I have always seen it. But I'm going to continue in reading this. He says, so man, if he can only control his imagination between A and B, he doesn't have to go to C, just from A to B. Take the first step. You assume the end. The end is where you begin. My end is my beginning. So I assume the end. I am the man I want to be. Were it true, I would be known by my friends first, so I bring them to my mind's eye and they see me. I let them see me. If I want to talk with them, accept their congratulations and not duck, but really hold my head up high, proud of what has happened to me, I accept the congratulations. Then I turn from what is the third step and let them talk between themselves. I'm listening to all of it, and I'm making it all real to me. And then I go into my wonderful state that is true. I begin to make plans of things that I would do, going to do now. And then in this simple little drama, I now credit it with reality. I give it reality. And then I see and test God. Come and test me. And then he quotes scripture. He says, come and test me and see that I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing so great that you haven't had room on earth to receive it. So come and test me, test the Lord and see. And he says, I give it all the tones of reality. I try to give it all the tones of reality, all the sensory vividness that I can muster. And whenever I do it, it works. Again, for me, I think the tones of reality, I've never really had an issue with seeing clearly in my mind. I just didn't believe in it. I didn't trust it. It's like when someone's telling you something and you just feel, I don't trust this person. That's what I would do with myself. I didn't realize I was doing it to myself for a long time. But I realized that the way to trust it is to let go and yield. That's the way to trust it. So you set the whole thing up and you give yourself entirely to it. You almost hand yourself over to it. You let go and just give it and credit it with reality. Now, he's just strictly speaking in this case of changing one's world or changing oneself. But in Carl Jung's case, you can do the same thing. I've done it with myself, where I've imagined I found myself in certain scenarios and scenes within me, certain situations that I credited with reality. That led me to, it's almost like you're exploring your own imagination. You're letting it happen in a sense, just letting it sort of develop before you. You don't try to change it. You just let it happen. But if you want to change it, if you want to modify certain things, you can take this approach that Neville gives, and you can start there. Start with people around you. You don't have, I don't even think it has to be people you know sometimes. I just like to over listen. I just hear words at times. I just hear a conversation. It'll be all black in my mind, and yet I'll just hear something and I'll just accept it. Other times I will see it. I will visualize it. But I've noticed that it's more about believing in its reality that makes it a reality than it is about becoming perfect for the details. Those don't matter as much than it is about crediting it reality. But I found this lecture interesting. I haven't gotten into the redemption parts of it yet, where he speaks about Christ, and I want to. But for this one, I found it interesting that he brought up Carl Jung and spoke about how, he didn't consider himself crazy for crediting it with reality. He didn't call himself mad. And at first, I was never going to call myself crazy for believing in an imaginal act within me, but I was afraid to, because I didn't know the consequences. That's what I was scared. I never considered myself to go mad. So it's interesting how other people explored their imaginations and decided to credit it with reality, even though really nothing told them to do it. They just did it on their own accord. And you can apply that same belief to yourself in your own life. But I'm going to end this one here. I found it interesting. Like I said, I want to speak also as well on his ideas of redemption and Neville's mystical experiences. I find them interesting as well, and I've had my own that I want to parallel with his. But that's it for this one, and I just want to notify everybody. I also do live talking and Q&As as well. If that interests you, it's for members. It's on the members channel, so hope to see you guys there, and thank you guys for listening.